Vaccinations save children's lives. They protect them against diseases like measles and polio, but so far not against Covid-19. But that could soon change. Many countries are considering vaccinating kids 12 and above against coronavirus. Thousands have already taken part in trials.
Usually I'm just at home doing online school and there's not much I can really do to fight back against the virus.
And with the results proving extremely successful, researchers are now looking at even younger age groups. So children will soon start to be vaccinated against the coronavirus. Canada has authorised the BioNTech Pfizer jab for ages 12 and up. Jason Kenney, the Premier of the worst-hit province, Alberta, says it will begin inoculating school children on Monday. Canada has faced criticism for its slow pace of vaccinations, despite having quite a large stockpile there. Here's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau getting his jab. Around a fifth of cases in Canada have been recorded in people under the age of 19. Other countries, including the US, are likely to also approve child vaccinations soon. Well, for more, we're joined by Dr Noni MacDonald, Professor of Paediatrics and Infectious Diseases at Dalhousie University and IWK Health Centre in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Thank you very much for joining us on this Covid-19 special. Can you just explain to us why we're only now seeing vaccines being approved for children and teenagers?
Not a surprise at all, Rob. The big point was when we looked at the epidemiology for COVID disease and who died, it was absolutely adults, especially older adults. It was not children. So in contrast to other diseases which were killing a lot of children in the past or having the worst disease like polio was much more a problem for young children than it was for adults, the pressure was on to get a vaccine for adults first.
But did they take into account the fact that children could potentially be spreading coronavirus?
They were looking at that, Rob, but they were not as big spreaders. It's not like influenza where with influenza, school-age kids are it. They just move that virus around like no tomorrow. But for COVID, again, kids were not the big spreaders. There's now, which we didn't know at the beginning, there's now some data to show that children in general, part of the reason they don't get such bad disease is they do have a different immune response to the virus than old people like myself. And they also don't have the same angiotensin enzyme, converting enzyme, in their lungs, which the virus, when it gets in there, that's one of the ways in. So there were two reasons why they didn't get such bad disease. And the other piece I wanted to just jump in on is that when we do drugs, we almost always start with adults because they can have permission when you're doing your trials. They're giving permission for themselves, where if we're going to do a trial in a child, we have to have the parents' permission to do it in the child. And the first thing they always ask is, well, what's the safety for adults for this? So that's why, I mean, there are many reasons why children were late. One, it didn't look like they were the biggest risk group. And two, we rarely start with children for many drugs to be studied in the first place.
And as you mentioned, actually, a lot of the trials haven't involved children at all, right? So it's only really the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine that has so far been tested on children. Will it take a long time to get the other vaccines available for children?
Well, there are trials that have been ongoing. The AstraZeneca child vaccine has just been halted for a little while, but Moderna's got one going on. There are other companies that are doing the same thing. And it's like a sequential thing. I have to get my adult stuff, trials done and those ones done. Then I have to go on and I will do older children, and then I will do the middle-aged children, and then I do little children. So even with Pfizer, we're only down to 12 years. We haven't done the 5 to 11-year-olds yet. That trial has just started, and they've just started enrolling for that. We probably won't have that data until maybe late June, early July.
As you mentioned, though, a crucial difference between vaccinating children and vaccinating adults is that it's not the person that's being vaccinated that you've got to persuade it's in their interest, right? You've got to persuade parents. Is that harder than persuading a parent to get themselves vaccinated?
Well, let me ask you a different question.
Okay.
If you were watching your child, being given a needle, would you rather have the needle yourself or your child have the needle? And most of us as parents would always like to protect our children from anything that's going to cause them pain. Okay, so to volunteer your child to come forward to be in a study, a lot of parents are a little more cautious about that. Now, I have to give you another piece. When they did this study for 12 to 15-year-olds, not only did the parents have to give consent, but the child themselves, the 12 to 15-year-old, have to say, and I agree too that I will be participating in this. So it's a twofer for that one that they need to get consent from. If it's a 5-year-old, well, if the child went running out of the room, it's unlikely he would get enrolled in the child, but you have to persuade the child that it's going to be okay. And most children don't like needles. They've had immunizations in the past. They know it hurts, and they're not keen to do this.
You mentioned about children not liking needles. We recently did a programme on the Covid-19 special about nasal spray vaccines and what hope they can offer. Is that something that is going to be a breakthrough for vaccinating children?
Any vaccine that could be given not with a needle is a breakthrough, not just for children, but there are 10 to 15% of adults who really don't like needles either. So it would be a breakthrough, period, for giving vaccines. There has been some data in the past on nasal spray vaccines. There was one maybe 25, 30 years ago, that flu vaccine that did cause a problem, had a serious side effect. But the more recent versions of the flu vaccine have been very acceptable for children, and they much prefer it to the needle. So this would be a big step forward. But there's other technologies that are trying to be developed, the micro patch ones where they're little tiny micro needles that you don't even feel. It's like putting a Band-Aid on. And again, any of these new ones that don't have needles, and if they can show them to be effective when they're being done, would be a wonderful step forward.
If I can just take a bit of a sidestep away from children and talk about pregnant women, a lot of countries are not offering vaccines to pregnant women. Is that something that needs to happen?
Pregnant women are like children. They're always the last into clinical trials for vaccines. They're always the last into clinical trials for drugs. And that's a real problem for us. So just as a comment in general about pregnant women, many of the drugs that are used to manage women in pregnancy, they're very, very old drugs, and it would be terrific if we had better drugs that could be used. But everybody's super cautious about doing anything in pregnant women, probably left over from the whole thalidomide disaster, what is that now, 40 years ago? And they're very, very worried because we already know with all pregnancies, there's always the risk of spontaneous abortion. There's always the risk of something going wrong with the fetus. So people are worried that I have to compare what would happen if no drug was given to compare what's happening with my drug. And most parents, pregnant women, really want to optimize the chance for their baby to be the best it could be. So not always super keen to be in a clinical trial.
Dr Noni MacDonald there. Now's the part of the programme where you get to ask the questions to our science correspondent, Derek Williams.
Can you get infected by a single droplet? Or does it take more than that?
This seemingly straightforward question turned into a real rabbit hole for me because it's so interwoven with so many other issues. A lot of them involve the still open questions surrounding variants. Do some of them need fewer viruses to kickstart an infection? Is that why some variants are proving to be so much more transmissible? Then there's the question of whether the dose of virus you're exposed to influences disease severity. So whether a low dose exposure maybe means you end up asymptomatic, and a high dose exposure may be that you end up in the hospital. And how do you explain what are known as super spreaders, the small percentage of infected people who experts think contribute in a really big way to numbers of subsequent cases? All of those questions are closely tied to the seemingly simple one of how many aerosols, in other words, how much virus, it takes exactly to infect someone. So there's plenty of theory and postulation out there, but the only way to really even begin to define some parameters is under controlled circumstances. And what that boils down to is that researchers have to infect some people intentionally with varying amounts of SARS-CoV-2 in order to see what happens next. Studies like that are called human challenge trials, and they're ethical minefields. One involving COVID-19 that's received a lot of coverage has been going on in Britain for a couple of months now, with the help of some brave, healthy volunteers between 18 and 30. Its first goal is to figure out the lowest possible dose of virus needed to reliably cause viral replication in the nose and the throat. In other words, a measurable infection. I'd expect at least a preliminary study telling us more to be published by this summer sometime.
And just before we go, it turns out that single-use paper masks aren't quite the fashion disaster that some people seem to think they are. A Dutch visual artist says she's created the perfect outfit for her vaccination day, a ball gown made entirely of her used face masks. Marion says she wants to make sure she shows up for the jab in style. She hopes her outfit will encourage people to get vaccinated. It includes protective gloves, a handbag, and naturally, a face mask. And that's all from this COVID-19 special. Goodbye.